Craig Baird, Canadian historian and host of several very interesting podcasts on Canada's history, most notably Canadian History EHX, joins us on this podcast once again. He recently authored a book. It's called Canada's Main Street, The Epic History of the Trans-Canada Highway. Welcome to the show once again, Craig. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing quite well. I just done my graduation exam, so I'm done with
Oh,
school for the
nice.
moment.
That's good.
Yeah. So, how has the book promotion going on?
It's been going quite well. On Saturday, I did my first book signing and reading at a bookstore in St. Albert, Alberta called Bailey Books. And it's been going well. I've just been, it's been selling well. It was briefly on the Toronto Star's bestseller list and is usually number one on Amazon in a few categories related to history, especially automotive history and such. And next week, I begin a 55-day journey around Canada where I'll be kind of visiting a lot of places that I talk about in the book. And so, yeah, it's been going very well.
All right. Yeah. So, are you excited for the road trip?
I am, yeah. The farthest east I've ever been is Montreal, and that was just in a quick layover on my way to Ottawa. So I'm really looking forward to going farther than Ottawa or Montreal and hitting the East Coast and really just taking the Trans-Canada Highway clear across the country.
Mhm. So, what made you interested in the Trans-Canada Highway?
Well, a person who was a big inspiration for me with what I do is Pierre Burton, and he wrote a two-volume book on the building of the CPR. So the CPR is, a massive part of Canada's history. The building the Transcontinental Railway helped bring in things like Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba. It also ensured British Columbia stayed within Canada. So it was a huge part of our history. And it tends to get most of the notice, but the Trans-Canada Highway doesn't. And I think it's just because as Canadians, we use it every day, or at least some of us do. But every Canadian has been on the Trans-Canada Highway at least once in their lives, or at least 99% of us. And it doesn't really get that notice because of that. But it took longer to build. It cost more to build. It required more cooperation between the provinces to build it. And I really wanted to kind of give it its due and really explore that history and what made this such a fascinating construction project that really changed Canadian history.
Hmm. Yeah. So, what do you believe is the historical significance of the TCH?
Well, I think there's a few things. First, it's our first national roadway that was, built under certain specifications to connect all the way from British Columbia to Newfoundland. I mean, when we think of the CPR, it doesn't go to Vancouver Island, it doesn't go to PEI or Newfoundland, but the Trans-Canada Highway does. The Trans-Canada Highway touches every single province, and it really helped build this country as we moved into the automotive age. I mean, Canada lagged behind a bit. We didn't have the first two people to drive across the country happened in 1912, and it's how I start the book. I talk about the two men who did that, but even then, they had to take boats and trains for parts of it because there were no roads. So the first person to drive completely across the country on a road without deviating into the United States or anywhere else didn't happen until about 1946, 47. So it took us a while, and around the time that was happening, the United States was building its, interstate uh, network. And Canada was really lagging behind in that regard. We had roads, but they were gravel roads. They were terrible roads. If you went for a road trip, you would often make sure you had a lot of spare tires because you were going to have plenty of flat tires because they were gravel roads, but even worse than gravel roads. And the impact of the Trans-Canada Highway on our history, it comes into the fact that all the provinces had to agree on a route because the federal government said, we'll pay 50% of the cost, you pay 50% of the cost, but you have to choose the route. So every province has to choose the route that it's going through. And especially when you get into Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, there's multiple routes that it can take, and they got to make sure that it all lines up. But then if you look at other things like Rick Hansen's marathon or Man in Motion tour in the late 19 excuse me, in the late 1980s, that was on the Trans-Canada Highway. And Terry Fox was on the Trans-Canada Highway, and a lot of other things have been on the Trans-Canada Highway. So it really forms kind of a fabric of our nation, but also serves as a major part of our economy. I mean, billions of dollars in commerce goes on that highway every single year.
Mhm. Tell me about your personal experience with the highway.
Well, I was born in Calgary, so the Trans-Canada Highway goes right through Calgary. In fact, 16th Avenue in Calgary is the Trans-Canada. And I think, again, that's why people don't really think too much about the Trans-Canada, because if you're going to a place like Peter's Drive-In Calgary, you're driving on 16th Avenue. You're not really thinking about the fact that you're on the Trans-Canada Highway, but you are. And then, it goes straight into Banff. So I've taken that route many times going into Banff and Kananaskis on the highway. And I've driven the highway. Well, obviously, I'll be driving it this year, but I drove it to Niagara Falls in 2009 and more or less took that highway pretty much the whole route. But then I also lived in a town called Gull Lake, Saskatchewan, which is just off the Trans Canada Highway. I was actually able to see the Trans Canada Highway from my house. And I drove that highway many, many, many times while living there. So it's always been something that's been kind of around me and something that's been a part of my life for many years.
Mhm. Why do you think that Canadians should be interested in how the highway was built?
Well, I think because it's part of our history and it was a major construction project, arguably one of the biggest construction projects for Canada during the 20th century. I think probably the St. Lawrence Seaway is probably the only thing, and maybe the Alaska Highway are the only things that really compete with that in terms of the scope and the cost. And every Canadian uses it. Every Canadian has been on that Trans Canada Highway at some point, and it's important to learn the history. I mean, some people did die building that highway. Not many, not anywhere near as many as died with the CPR, but some people did. And also, it's a great way to like see the country. Like it's amazing to me that I can get onto the Trans Canada Highway, say outside of Calgary, and I can stay on that same road and reach the Atlantic Ocean. And I think that we just take that for granted and we don't really look at that history and what was involved in building it and the cooperation that was needed to build it. And with nationalism and such on the rise in Canada, a lot of people are going to be driving that highway this year to go to our national parks and go to our various cities.
Mhm. So how long would it take, uh, for if you make a road trip to go from the start to the end of the highway?
Well, it's taking me 55 days to go from Edmonton to the Atlantic Ocean and back. But I am taking a very slow route. I'm going about driving, 3 to 4 hours a day on car and tent camping the whole way. So I'm doing it very differently than a lot of people do it. But if you were to drive nonstop, so say you had a passenger, you drove for 12 hours, drove for 12 hours, it would take you about 8 days to get, 8 to 9 days to get from Newfoundland all the way to Vancouver Island, especially through Ontario. I don't think people realize how big Ontario is. Just driving over Lake Superior takes you about 2 days. It's a very long journey. And it's a single highway there. It's not like in the prairies where it's double split in Ontario, it's just a single highway. But if you were just kind of taking a leisurely route, you were driving, say, 600 kilometers a day, it would probably take you about maybe a week and a half to go, maybe 2 weeks, depending on how often you stop. I mean, there's a lot of roadside attractions on the way, so there's a lot of things to see and stop at. But it would probably take, yeah, I would say about a week and a half to just do the whole drive, yeah, without, with sleeping and such.
Mhm. Yeah. So tell me about the roadside attractions.
Well, there's various roadside attractions that have been built on the Trans Canada Highway. Probably the two most famous would be Mac the Moose in Moose Jaw, which was the world's largest moose. And then in Norway, they built a larger moose. So then Moose Jaw built its antlers just a little bit higher, so that now it's the largest moose again. And it's actually kind of cool to see. But probably I would say the most famous attraction on the Trans Canada Highway. Well, one of them is the Wawa Goose. It was actually built right after the Trans Canada Highway was finished. because Wawa was kind of cut off from the rest of the country. It didn't really have much in the way of a road. So as soon as that road came through, it was just to the north of Wawa. So they built a Canada Goose. It's this gigantic goose, and it's pretty impressive to see. But that was the case for a lot of communities. The Trans-Canada Highway, other than places like Calgary, Regina, and Winnipeg, at least to start before the bypass roads were built, they the didn't go through towns. It kind of went north of towns or south of towns. So you needed a way to draw people to your town, and that's what you use the roadside attractions for. And that's where things like the Wawa Goose come from. Just a few months ago, I finished a poll contest where I was asking my followers, what's your favorite roadside attraction in Canada? And the one that won was the one that's just outside of Thunder Bay on the Trans Canada Highway, which is the Terry Fox Memorial and Lookout, which is this gigantic statue of Terry Fox at the spot where his Marathon of Hope ended in 1980. So there's lots of amazing roadside attractions along the way. Pretty much every single town along the way has them. Some are just real tourist traps just to try and get you in town, and some are actually really impressive to see.
Mhm. Yeah. I know Terry Fox is a very well-known figure in Canada, but I know only know like very scarce details about him. I know that he had cancer and that he went
Mhm.
on a run like Forrest Gump. So yeah, tell me more about him.
Yeah. Terry Fox is probably arguably one of the most famous Canadians in history. He's actually going to be on our $5 bill coming up. He was chosen to be on our money. And so what happened was in 1977, he developed a cancer in his leg, and it resulted in his leg being amputated at the knee, and he decided to raise money for cancer research. So he started what's called the Marathon of Hope. And he started it in, I believe, April of 1980. And what he did was he essentially, on one leg, ran a marathon every single day. And his goal was to raise $1 million, or not $1 from every Canadian at the time. So it would be about $25 million. So it was a very kind of small little fundraiser at the start. It was growing in popularity. And then by the time he reached Ontario, it was this massive thing. He was probably the most famous Canadian. He met, people like Bobby Orr and Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And by the time he reached Toronto, he was pretty much an icon. But his cancer returned as he approached Thunder Bay. So he had to stop his Marathon of Hope at that point. And then he died a year later, I think he was about 24, yeah, or 23, about 23 or 24. So there's a statue of him in St. John's where he dipped his leg into the Atlantic Ocean. There's a statue of him in Victoria where he would have dipped his leg in if he had finished his Marathon of Hope. And then there's a statue of him, a very large one, at Thunder Bay where his Marathon of Hope ended. I mean, there's also statues of him in like Ottawa and everywhere else, and there's probably about 15 schools named for him. And so the people around him created the Terry Fox Run, which runs every single year, raising money for cancer research. And to date, about $900 million has been raised in his name for cancer research. And it's actually helped so much that the cancer he had in the 1970s that led to the loss of his leg, if he were alive now and were to have that same cancer, he would not have lost his leg. That's how far that money and that research has gone. So in Canada, he's probably uh, I would say probably the most beloved figure in Canadian history,
Wow.
maybe next to John Candy.
I'm a big John Candy fan, so yeah. So I'm guessing had he been alive throughout the whole run, he would have made it from St. John's to Victoria, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, he absolutely would have. He stopped his run in September, so it would have been tough going. It would have been tough going through the prairies as you're getting into the winter months. But yeah, he would have finished it. And then his friend was Rick Hansen, who was a paraplegic, so he was confined to a wheelchair, and he was inspired by Terry Fox to do his Man in Motion tour, and that involved going around the world in the wheelchair, so 40 countries over the course of I think 18 months, or not 18, 26 months, something like that. And he raised about $27 million for that.
Mhm. Now, one thing I'm curious about is how did they construct the highway in like passages where the land is not contiguous, like if you want to connect with Newfoundland, for example.
Right. So what happens there, and it's the same with Prince Edward Island and Vancouver Island. So in Newfoundland, even though our Prime Minister John Diefenbaker tamped down some asphalt in 1962 in the Rogers Pass, the highway to kind of complete the highway wasn't actually completed officially. Like in Newfoundland, it wasn't finished at all. It was still gravel, but it was kind of a symbolic thing. But in Newfoundland, it goes from Port aux Basques up through the top of Newfoundland around until you get to St. John. So it doesn't go straight across Newfoundland, it goes around the top. It's actually quite a long journey. It's about 900 kilometers. And so that is considered part of the Trans-Canada Highway. So you would take a ferry from Cape Breton up to Newfoundland and then do that and then take a ferry back. Now, it was the same thing with Prince Edward Island when the Trans-Canada Highway was built because obviously it's an island and you only had about 40 kilometers of the Trans-Canada Highway in Prince Edward Island. Now it is connected to the network because of the Confederation Bridge, which was finished in May 31st, 1997. So now it is actually part of the Trans-Canada Highway. And then it's the same thing with Vancouver Island. You take a ferry from Vancouver to Vancouver Island, and then you continue on the Trans-Canada Highway until you get to Victoria.
Okay. How long did it take for the highway to be completed?
Well, various parts of the highway kind of existed already. They were, just regular dirt road highway, some paved road, but there wasn't a lot. So the government wanted everything to be kind of the same specifications. So the 1949 was when you had the Trans-Canada Highway Act signed, and the federal government said, "We'll pay you 50% of the cost. You pay 50%. Provinces decide the route." And in the east, that's not really a big deal. There's only one route it can really take. But as you get to Manitoba, then the routes start to split and you got to figure out exactly how that's going to line up. The first province to actually finish the highway was Saskatchewan, which is flat as can be. It's a very easy place to build through. It finished in 1957. So that was the deadline to actually finish the entire highway, but Saskatchewan was the only province to actually meet that deadline. And then Alberta and Manitoba were the next provinces to do that. So John Diefenbaker tamped down the asphalt in 1962 in British Columbia's Rogers Pass to say that the highway is done. And it kind of was. It was a dirt road that went across the country. You could actually take it, but it was still pretty rough. Through the 1960s, you had Newfoundland finish in 1965. And by this point, the federal government had to step in again. And it said it renegotiated the agreement. And it said, we will pay 90% of the cost on the 10% most difficult portions in your province, just to kind of get this moving. It would also pay 100% of the cost in all national parks. So in Newfoundland, it was finished in 1965, and the federal government pretty much paid for the entire thing just to get it done. Quebec did not sign on to the agreement until about 1960-61, because before that, the premier was Maurice Duplessis, and he did not want to be part of this. He was very authoritative and kind of ruled with an iron fist, but he died in 1959. And then the Quiet Revolution started in Quebec in the 1960s, which led to the province joining the Trans-Canada Highway Network officially. The Maritimes, like Nova Scotia and such, finished in the mid 1960s. But in terms of the highway being done officially, it was about 1970-71. So if you look at the CPR, it technically started in 1971 with or 1871 with the surveying, and it was finished in 1885, but the actual bulk of the building of that was done from about 1878 to 1885, so you're talking about 8 years. The Trans-Canada Highway took 21 years to finish, so it's a much larger project. But and then there'd be upgrades, there'd be twinning of highways, there would be a variety of things that would happen for years to come.
Mhm. Yeah. So tell me a bit about how the highway, or sorry, how the part where the highway runs through Alberta was constructed.
Well, running through Alberta, it came through the south. Edmonton really wanted to have the Trans Canada Highway through its city, but that would involve it having to go north and then through Jasper and then back south. So Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC agreed to take the southerly route. Now, a big reason for that is Americans. They wanted to draw Americans up to Canada and have a route that they could take clear across the country. Another big reason was Banff. Banff at the time, as it is today, was a huge tourist attraction. So you wanted a top-notch highway to lead people from Calgary straight into Banff. And it was also the line that the CPR took. So building through Alberta was relatively easy as they reached the border, through Medicine Hat, and then it goes up through Brooks, and then it hits Calgary. It took a bit longer as it reached Banff. The Banff Highway was already there, but it had to be upgraded quite a bit, and overpasses had to be made and things like that. So the longest portion, or the costliest portion, was through Banff, and the Banff National Park. But because that was a national park, the federal government paid for that whole thing, and it didn't cost Alberta at all anything at all. So building through Alberta was relatively easy until you started to get into the foothills of the Rockies.
Mhm. Right. So you mentioned that the highway runs through all 10 of the provinces. So I'm guessing none of the territories were touched by the highway too. And
No, no,
no.
No, they weren't. You have what's called now the Trans-Canada Highway Network, and so you have the actual highway itself that runs through southern Canada. And then you have the Yellowhead Highway that goes up through from just after Brandon, Manitoba, goes up through Saskatoon. Then it goes into Edmonton, and then to Jasper, and then onwards, and eventually onto, I think, Prince Rupert, or yeah, Prince Rupert, I think. And then you also have the Crow's Nest Highway, which branches off from Medicine Hat, goes through Lethbridge, and goes through the extreme southern portion of Alberta and British Columbia. But nothing goes through the territories. Obviously, Nunavut, you wouldn't have anything because it's very isolated, and there's no real roads other than around major settlements. So a lot of it is flying in through air. You do have roads that go up to Yellowknife, but it's a very long journey. I mean, you can fly an hour and a half, or you can drive for 15 hours. And then you have the Alaska Highway, which will take you up through into the Yukon from Alberta. But those aren't really part of the Trans Canada Highway network.
Yeah. So I didn't go through elementary school in Canada, so I missed the geography classes. So why are there provinces and territories?
It's a good question. I think Well, you have provinces because those were what was created when Canada was forming. So the first four provinces were Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And then in 1870, Manitoba came in, but it was a very small little postage stamp province. It eventually grew to its current size as territory was added. And then British Columbia came in 1871, and then Prince Edward Island in 1873. And then from that point on until 1905, you had what was called the Northwest Territories. And that covered pretty much most of Manitoba, all of Saskatchewan, all of Alberta, the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, and what eventually became Nunavut. And then in 1905, Alberta and Saskatchewan were carved out of the Northwest Territories, and they became provinces. And the main probably reason that the territories were never formed into provinces was just because of population, and they were quite remote from everything else. The Yukon Territory was created in 1898 because of the Yukon or the Klondike Gold Rush. We wanted to make sure that the Americans weren't claiming that territory. But because of this relatively small population, I mean, all the territories combined have a smaller population than um, I think Edmonton's population is at least 8 or 9 times just what those territories are. So they remain territories mostly just because of population and where they're located. But some places like the Yukon do push for becoming a province, but I don't imagine that'll ever happen.
Yeah, I'm guessing like the United States territories, like Puerto Rico and such, the residents of Canadian territories are, full-fledged citizens and such, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, 100%. They have representatives in Parliament that not a ton. I think in total there's like four MPs who are elected from the territories into Parliament, but they are represented in Parliament. Everybody can vote in federal elections. They're Canadian citizens. Absolutely, it's not a case of like Puerto Rico where they have no representation at all.
So it's better than Puerto Rico even.
Much better, much better. Yeah.
Okay. Well, how did Canada become a nation of cars?
Well, I think a lot is to do with the United States. below us. They started really developing the car, and Canada did as well. And if you look at certain cities, especially like I'm outside of Edmonton, Edmonton is a car city. It's spread out. It's a very large city, not in population, although I think we have about 1 million people, but in terms of size, it's quite large. And I think just as time went on, Canada did manufacture its own cars, especially in Ontario. And especially with the great distances, you could take the train, but eventually the car just started to take over, especially after the Second World War. And that really necessitated the need to start building highways that were going to be adequate for handling the amount of cars that were on the road. I mean, the first cars that start to appear in Canada are in about the 18 or not the 18, the early 1900s, and just slowly grew from there as the provinces worked to build the roadways that they needed.
Yeah. So is Canada still a nation of trains?
No, unfortunately. I mean, you could build a train line running from Quebec City all the way down to Toronto and beyond. It's a straight line, and we don't really have that. We have via rail, but like a lot of people don't take that, and it costs a lot of money. Like it's not a commuter rail. It is a beautiful way to see the country, but it's just, yeah, a lot of places pulled up their tracks. You can see in a lot of small towns where the railroad used to go through, Canada just kind of went overwhelmingly to the car. And it's unfortunate because going by train would be a really amazing way to see this country. And unfortunately, we've really kind of gotten rid of that. I mean, you do have trains going around the country every single day. When I do my walks in the morning, I see at least two or three trains go by because we are, we're shipping oil, we're shipping a lot of things on trains. But in terms of people traveling on a train, there's very few. I imagine, if you went to 100 people randomly, maybe two or three have actually ridden the train, other than like in Fort Edmonton Park where it's there as part of a historical aspect. But yeah, I'd say like very little. Most people fly too. Driving across the country, it takes a long time. It's not a quick journey. So for example, what I'm doing, I could drive to Halifax and take days, or I could fly to Halifax in 6 hours or 5 hours or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I was in Canada, I took a via rail train. I think it may have been to Montreal. And I took a few like GO trains too.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm sure they have that in Edmonton as well.
We have like our LRT that's in Edmonton. There is
Okay.
an effort in place to build a high-speed rail going from Calgary to Banff. They really should build it from Edmonton to Calgary. I don't know why you would build it from Calgary to Banff. Banff is already way too busy. But having a high-speed rail across the country, I think would be amazing, but the cost would be unbelievable. So I don't ever see that happening.
I see. And is the Canada Pacific Railway still operative?
It is. It's not the CPR anymore. It's like the CPR and Kansas Railway. Here, I'm actually just going to look it up because they got sold just a little while ago.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, so we do still have the Canada Pacific Railway, but it was purchased and like merged with the Kansas Railway at some point. But it still exists. Like it's still out there running and being part of our history, but it's not what it was. I mean, every Canadian took the CPR at some point during their lives, and now barely anybody ever does.
What were the toughest challenges in the construction of the TCH?
Well, there was various parts of it that were very difficult to build. Obviously, through most of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta was very easy to build through. British Columbia was very difficult because of the mountainous terrain. You had to build a lot of bridges. I think Saskatchewan had two or three bridges that had to be built, whereas British Columbia had about 20 bridges that had to be built. So it was very difficult and costly to build through British Columbia. And then other portions that were difficult were Newfoundland. because they were essentially building through virgin territory and they were building the long way. And it took a long time to build that. It was gravel for a while until it was eventually paved, but it was difficult to build through. And then the Lake Superior route, going just over north of Lake Superior, you're building through the Canadian Shield and you're building through muskeg and like granite rock that's 4 billion years old. And so it's very difficult to build through there. Something the CPR builders found out as well. So those would be the most difficult portions, the ones that took the longest and the ones that were the costliest.
Yeah. So, were there any like significant disputes between the federal government and the provincial ones? I think you've mentioned Newfoundland and Quebec.
Yeah, so Quebec would be one. That was just more Maurice Duplessis not wanting to share any power, but then he died, and when Quebec went through its quiet revolution, then they immediately signed on, and the highway was already really built. It just needed to be widened a bit. It wasn't like it was a dirt road; it was a paved road. They had very little that they had to do, and there were certain things that were done in Montreal with interchanges and an underground tunnel as the province or the city was getting ready for Expo 67, which was a huge event for Canada. Uh, Newfoundland wasn't so much a case of like a dispute. It was again just a premier who held a lot of power and was just kind of holding the government to task until they paid for the majority of it. There weren't too many disputes. There were some disputes in Parliament. Every party in Parliament agreed that the Trans Canada Highway should be built. They were just divided on what the cost should be. So the Liberals, who were the ruling party at the time, like I said 50-50, but then other parties said, no, the federal government should pay for the entire thing. And other parties said the provinces should, and the provinces wanted the federal government to pay more. So it was more of disputes with money and such. The federal government making the provinces choose the route was probably a smart thing to do, because if they had chosen the route, then there would be claims that the federal government was overreaching and deciding the route through the provinces. But doing that also made it difficult. It took longer because some provinces were going through elections, and if you're going through an election, you don't want to say the route's going through Calgary, because then people in Edmonton might not vote for you. So you got to wait till after the election is done before you actually choose the route. So there wasn't like a ton of major disputes, just kind of like disagreements on certain things.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Expo 67. That'll be to celebrate the centenary, right?
Yeah, so what happened there was Moscow was actually supposed to host the
Oh,
World's Fair,
oh,
and they
right.
pulled out. And then Montreal said, okay, well, we'd like to do it. And because it was 1967, and like you said, it was the Canadian centennial, we took it on. And the Expo 67 was a huge event. It was kind of one of those first times where Canada really opened itself to the world, and we really celebrated ourselves during the centennial. And the Expo 67 became the most successful World's Fair of the 20th century. I mean, Canada at the time had a population of 25 million, and 50 million people went to that World's Fair. It was a massive success. And having the Trans Canada Highway more or less done by that point helped, because a lot of Canadians took the Trans Canada Highway to go to Expo 67.
Mhm. Tell me about some of the notable people who were behind the construction.
Well, there wasn't too many. Like when you look at something like the CPR, you have a lot of famous people. You have, Major Rogers, who finds the Rogers Pass on his birthday. You have Sir Sanford Fleming, who kind of surveys a lot of the route before he's kind of kicked out of the company, and then he buys a bunch of shares and becomes a director in the company. You had Sir Donald Smith, who was the person who hammered in the last spike in the famous photo. You had Sir John A. Macdonald, who was kind of the one that was overseeing everything. And you had Sir Hugh Allen, who was the person in charge of the CPR. So you had a lot of big figures with the CPR, but you don't have that with the Trans Canada Highway. You have our Prime Minister, Sir Louis Saint Laurent. You have people like Ernest Manning in Alberta. You have Tommy Douglas in Saskatchewan, but there's no like big figure. A lot of the big figures with Trans Canada Highway come after its construction, like I mentioned with Terry Fox and Rick Hansen and these people who use the highway as a way to, raise money or promote something about Canada or things like that who become part of the fabric of our country. But during the construction, you don't have those big names. And that might be the reason why there hasn't been many books on the Trans-Canada Highway, because there isn't these grand stories to it that you have with the CPR.
No, until now, I suppose.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I know that there's a NFB documentary, right, called Trans-Canada Summer, right? It was
Yep.
narrated by Pierre Burton. I think you
Mhm.
mentioned his name earlier. Yeah, he's a well-known historian of Canada, right?
Yeah, yeah. So for me, Peter Burton is a massive inspiration. He wrote about 50 books over the course of his life, and I've been trying to collect all of them. And I've got 48, so I'm looking for the last two. And he was, somebody who started out as a journalist and wrote books on certain things, not really history related. And then he wrote the Klondike because he was actually from the Yukon, and that became a hit. And then he wrote The National Dream and The Last Spike, which were gigantic hits. And from that point on, he was writing about Canadian history, and he really kind of wrote in a way that made it accessible for people. Academics don't really like Pierre Burton, but the Canadian public loved him because he was writing something that really kind of resonated, but it was written in a way that was accessible. It wasn't dry. And yeah, he's still well known today, but he died 21 years ago, so obviously time starts to lessen how many people know him, especially as new generations come along. But for 50 years he was probably one of the most famous Canadians in the country.
Mhm. Yeah. So as an aside, what are some of his titles that you're missing right now?
I can actually, I have a spreadsheet. I can tell you the exact two. Um, every book that I've received, because I have a rule that I go to. Oh no, I won't be able to. My my microphone's plugged into my external drive port, so I can't bring it up. But with his books, what I do is I don't buy them online because I could easily just buy them on Amazon. I have to either find them in secondhand stores or they have to be gifted to me by followers. So I found about 20 in secondhand stores. I found a few that were autographed that'll just turn up at, thrift stores. And then the other 28 or so, 25, 28 were all sent to me by followers who had them and wanted to get rid of them. One of the hardest to find was Masquerade, because he wrote that book under a pen name as Lisa Condironk, and it's a terrible. It's not a good book at all. It's kind of like a sexual thriller. Uh, it's he's very good at writing nonfiction, like a fantastic nonfiction writer. He's not a good fiction writer. So it's a very hard book to find. So somebody actually was able to send that to me, and I was very happy to find that. But yeah, he had a lot of books out there. And they turn up at thrift stores all the time because a lot of people, people pass away and then the kids are just putting the books into thrift stores. And like I said, sometimes you'll find one that's autographed. And I I've had multiple copies of certain books because I like having different editions, and especially if it's autographed, I'll buy it even if I have 5 copies of it.
Mhm. Oh yeah, yeah. When I was living in Canada, I would dive to like these used bookstores and sometimes
Oh
like
yeah,
get very very interesting texts.
yeah. You never know what you find. I found an autographed Farley Mowat and No Bird Sang, and it's one of my favorite books. So to find it autographed is like, oh, okay, this is why would you give this to a thrift store? But I bought it for $5.
Mhm. Yeah, a friend of mine who now lives in Belleville, Ontario, actually sends me a copy of Farley Mowat's one of his books.
Oh,
I think it was called "In Praise of Older Women," I believe. Yeah, that.
hmm. Yeah, he's another person who wrote a lot of books, who's very much celebrated in Canada and very much beloved, and was friends with Pierre Burton, and there's plenty of pictures of the two of them together.
Yeah, I should look more into CanLit. All right. So, tell me about the research process behind the book.
The research process behind the book. I signed the contract to build the or to write the book in May of 2023, and then the book was finished in July 2024. So it was a long process of writing the book. Usually I just kind of went chronologically. So I start the book by talking about the first Trans-Canada trip by Jack Haney and Tom Wilby. And then I just kind of chronologically looked at the various highways that were built in the 1920s, 1930s. And then I get into the building of the Trans-Canada Highway. And often I would just be researching a certain section and then I would write that section and then just keep kind of going like that the entire process and then eventually editing and everything. And yeah, finished it in July 2024, and then it came out on May 13th of this year.
All right. Yeah. I hope the book gains much success.
Yeah, same. It's so far so good.
Yeah. So would you like take advantage of the road trip as a sort of a book tour as well?
Yeah, I'm probably not going to go do book signings because uh those take time to like line up and everything. Plus, I have to have a lot of copies and things like that. So I will be using it as a way to promote the book. So I'll probably just be taking the book and then just taking pictures of it at, like the Wawa Goose and things like that, just to promote it as I go across the country. I have a lot of people who also want to me to sign the book as I go across the country. So I'll be doing a lot of that as well.
Okay. Well, finally, I'd like to end on this. What do you expect to see or learn from this upcoming road trip of yours?
Well, the point of the road trip is to start to see a lot more of Canada. I spend a lot of my time working on Canadian history, but I don't explore the country. So the road trip is a way for me to start making more content related to video, to visiting sites that I talk about. But I'm also kind of turning this into my second book where I'm going to be talking about Canada's history, but I'm also interviewing current Canadians to kind of look at our past and our present and blending those two things together. So the whole road trip is just about seeing the country, talking to Canadians, and really just and enjoying the country that it is right now. We have what's called the Canada Strong Pass, which launches tomorrow. It's a new thing that the federal government's doing, which gives you free access to our national parks and museums and things like that to really push Canadians to explore their own country. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do is just show Canadians the amazing country they have. And, you don't always have to go to a resort in Mexico for vacation. You can explore the country that you have.
Certainly. Yeah. I hope to visit Canada, yeah, at the nearest possible opportunity.
Nice.
All
That's a
right.
good place to visit.
Okay. With that said, thank you very much, Craig Baird, for once again joining the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.